Hi and welcome to Midnight Cry. I'm your host, Rommel Gussain, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who'll be discussing with us a little bit about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. First of all, welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, it's good to be here, Rommel.
Now, on this episode and on this series, actually, we want to discuss a little bit about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Do we know much about his life?
Well, you know, Rommel, it's very important that we do discuss Muhammad because he is the foundation of everything Muslims are dependent on. If you stop and think, when you look at the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, everything they believe comes from one man. Have you thought about that? Everything they believe comes from one man.
Wow.
What if he's wrong? So it's important that we ask this question. And what we want to do in this whole series is to unpack who this one man is. Now, to start off, we need to look at his biography. And there's about, in English language, there's about 1,500 biographies that talk about Muhammad. Let me just go through some of them, the ones that I have read. Obviously, there's no time to read all 1,500. But there are some larger ones that are more important. Armstrong is probably one of the more popular ones that Muslims love. And the reason why is because she gives a very sanitized view of Muhammad. Armstrong is a Catholic. I think she was a nun at one time. When she looks at Muhammad, she only picks out that which she likes and throws out what she doesn't like. So it's a sanitized view, a very artificial view of
Very
Muhammad.
biased, yes.
Absolutely, and that you can see why a lot of Muslims like her biography. Montgomery Watt, probably better known. His biography is older. And he looks at Muhammad as a statesman and as a prophet. And so he looks at both his political power. He looks about how he came into Medina and created a political entity, created the Khilafah, and he sees that side of Muhammad. Interesting to bring that into it. Maxine Rodinson looked at Muhammad as an ideal. As he says, the utopia that has never been achieved, which is always before us. Again, a rather sanitized view. Interestingly, in the middle of his biography, I'm not sure why the editors didn't see it. He comes out with a statement, almost of frustration. What am I doing with this man? And why am I, almost as if to say, I'm wasting my time on this? Because you could see that he was frustrated with the person that he was trying to talk about. A probably more honest view of a biography is one written by Michael Cook, Dr. Michael Cook out of England, where it's a very short biography. You can read it in a few hours, and where he unpacks the historical problems with Muhammad. And we're going to talk more about that later on. I like that because it shows that there are some problems with his life. But if I'm going to recommend any biography of Muhammad, I would probably go to Alfred Guillaume's translation. Alfred Guillaume takes the original, or the closest to the original biography that comes from Ibn Hisham himself. Ibn Hisham was the compiler of Muhammad's first biography. He was writing in 820 to 833, died in 833, so the 9th century. That's the earliest biography we have of Muhammad. And what he does is he goes to Ibn Hisham and he actually just lifts it out of the Arabic and put it first into French. And that's now been translated into many other languages, including English. So when I recommend a biography to my students, I always recommend Guillaume. And the reason why is because you're going to the original material. You're going to that which is the standard, the classical model.
So anyone that would want to learn about Islam, you can't simply learn about the life of Muhammad simply through the Quran. You would have to learn through one of these biographies.
Yeah, you'd have to go to the biographies, and you need to start with that classical model. And what we need to do now is look at that classical model. And let's go ahead and just unpack the classical model. And this is the model that you'll hear every Muslim give you. This is the model that every biography will start with. And it's the model that we assume has been around for 1,400 years.
Yes.
Now, hold on to that 1,400. We're going to come back to that. Because that's what they want us to believe. That model of what we call the classical model starts with a premise that Muhammad was born in 570. We don't have any reason to question that. But he didn't start receiving his revelation until 610 AD. And what the classical model tells us is that he went up into a cave called the Hijrah cave. And the Hijrah cave is outside of Mecca where he lived. It is a cave where he would go and meditate sometimes for months at a time. While he was up there, suddenly he gets a revelation, angel that appears to him, Jibril, and says, Akra. And of course, his response was Ma'akra. recite. And he says, well, I cannot recite. You cannot read or write, according to what Muslims tell us. The angel does this 3 times. He goes, then lets him go, and he quickly flees back to Mecca, goes to his wife Khadija, who's his only wife at that time, and he relates this story to her. And she does this interesting test where she has him sit on both of her legs and ask the question, was this a spirit? And then she disrobes and asks him the same question. And then once he says, yes, that was a spirit, she knows that he's telling the truth. Why? Because no angel would be in the presence of a disrobed woman.
So what do you mean by disrobed?
A woman that has taken her clothes off, no angel would stay around for that because of her modesty. And when she asks, is that the angel now? And the fact that he's not there proves that he's telling the truth, or so that was an angel.
This was some type of test.
It's a test. It's a test. Now, once that happens, that's 610. From 610 then till 622, Muhammad then receives these revelations quite regularly. And when you open the Quran, when you split it in half, roughly around Surah 20 to the end, from Surah 20 around Surah 21 up until Surah 114. Surah means book. The last part of the Quran, the last half of the Quran, are those Meccan surahs that he received in Mecca between 610 and 622. Once in 622, he then he gets a call from a city called Medina. It used to be called Yathrib. We call it Medina today. Yathrib was the archaic name for it. The Arabs that were there were known as the Ansar, and they are having problems with the Jews, who control much of the commerce there in Medina. And that difficulty between the Ansar and the Jews was a difficulty they could not eradicate. So they come to Muhammad as a neutral person and ask if he would come and arbitrate between them. So he decides to do that, and he leaves Mecca, goes up to Medina, and that's known as the Hijrah. Hijrah, as you well know in Arabic, means basically the Exodus. Moves up there in 622, and that's what the classical model tells us. Comes into Medina, tries to create a relationship with the Jews, and for 2 years it works. For 2 years he has that relationship. After 2 years, that relationship breaks down. According to tradition, it's primarily because they did not accept him as a prophet, for a very good reason. There are some reasons why. We'll get into it later on in this series as to why they didn't accept him as a prophet. 4 major reasons. Let's wait and hold on for that. Once they don't accept him as a prophet, he then rejects them. And that happens around 624. So from 624, everything changes. He then also changes as far as his relationship with the surrounding tribes. There's a caravan that is returning from Gaza down back to Mecca, and Muhammad goes out to that caravan and attacks it in Badr. And so we have the great Battle of Badr. The Battle of Badr, with 300 men, he defeats 900 of the Meccans. Comes back rejoicing that God is on his side. And that gives him an enormous amount of authority, which he takes as a political authority. And so most Muslims stipulate that at that point is when the Islamic State begins, the Khilafah, as we now know it, the Islamic State. It begins in 624 after the Battle of Badr. But he turns towards the Jews, and he blames them for not supporting him in that battle. And the first Jewish tribe of the 3 that were there in Medina, the Banu Qanuqa, he then throws out of Medina. They travel up to the north. A year later, the Meccans come to revenge against that defeat in Badr, and you have the Battle of Uhud in 625. That battle Muhammad loses. In fact, he is wounded, almost dies from his wounds, comes back to Medina, angered by what has happened, blames the Jews again. And he throws out the Banu Nadir family, the second of the Jewish tribes. 2 years later, the Meccans come up, and they should have continued their advance after the Battle of Uhud. Why they go back to Mecca, we don't know. But nonetheless, we have a third battle, great battle, in the Battle of the Trenches in 627, where Muhammad digs a large trench, which the Meccans cannot cross, and that stops it. So it's a stalemate. Neither side wins. Muhammad comes back, knowing that he's not been defeated, and he blames the last remaining Jewish tribe, known as the Banu Qurayza family. Now, this then continues. These battles then start to proliferate. And if you read his biography, if you read Alfred Guillaume, you'll see that almost every year there's 1 or 2 or 3 battles, these raids. He goes on raid after raid after raid after raid, and they start proliferating, so that by 630, he's ready to then conquer Mecca. In 629, he actually goes down to Mecca, and those in Mecca come out and they have a treaty with him, say, listen, please don't conquer us. They realize how powerful he's become, and they have a treaty of Hudaybiyah, which stipulates that for 1 year he will not attack Mecca, but anybody that wants to leave Mecca to come and join him in Medina is free to do so. That year then finishes, he then goes into Mecca and he just walks right in. There is no battle. Basically, they're defenseless. They just let him move right in. And so at 630, Mecca comes under his control. And then by that time, all of the central part of Arabia, known as the Hijaz, comes under his control.
Wow, that's...
2 years later, then he dies. How? We don't know. Some traditions say that he dies possibly by poisoning. Nonetheless, he dies in 632. Now, at that time, the Quran had not yet been written down. When he dies, all these revelations that he's receiving in Medina from 622 to 632, that's the first part of the Quran, this part of the Quran, the first half of the Quran. That material is quite different than the latter part, the Meccan material. And you can see there's a big difference between these two halves of the Quran. And it reflects his life. In Mecca, he was basically a minority. He was a persecuted minority. When he leaves and goes up to Medina, he only has about 80 followers. Some traditions say he has as many as 200, but it's a very small group, not very many at all. From 622, then up until 632, the last 10 years of his life, not only does he get political power, but he gets an enormous amount of social power, economic clout, and of course, he has all these revelations. So when he dies, the Quran has not yet been recorded on paper or on parchment.
You mentioned that this was the classical account.
This is all the classical account.
So the classical account, I just want our viewers to understand this. This is the well-accepted view. This is what a Muslim would say. Okay.
And no one's ever disputed this account. Have you come up with any other account?
No.
Have you heard of any other reference point? No. Why? For one very good reason. No one's bothered to even look at the sources from this account. Because let me ask you, Romuald, do you know where all these stories come from? Do you know where this whole account comes from? Do you know where all this material comes from?
No.
You'd like to think it comes from people that were writing at that time.
Yes.
You would like to think it comes from people that actually knew him, that actually viewed it, that were there, present at the time, like we have with the biblical account of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And we said this in the earlier series, when you look at the first 4 Gospels of Jesus Christ, they are accounts of what Jesus did and what Jesus said.
That's right, especially if you're writing an autobiography. As we mentioned in the first part, an autobiography in its definition needs to be written by someone, whether it's the person or someone that was a close associate with the person that they're writing about.
Now we're not even asking for an autobiography because we know that Muhammad could not read or write. We're asking for a biography from an eyewitness.
Yes.
For Jesus' case, we have 2 biographies. We know that Matthew and John were both there. John was there at the foot of the cross. John was with Jesus. So was Matthew. For 3 years, they knew exactly what Jesus was doing, what he said, and where he went. The other 2, Mark and Luke, were not with Jesus, but they got it from the eyewitness accounts, and that's why we can trust them. So you have 4 biographies from 4 different viewpoints.
About the same person.
About the same person.
Yes.
With 4 different agendas, from 4 different styles of writing. We're asking just for one biography of Muhammad from his lifetime.
But I mean, you mentioned that there was up to 1,500, I think you said?
Now, those are English translations today. But here's the question. Can you find any biography of Muhammad from the 7th century? No. Did anybody write down his story? Concerning all those companions, all the references to the companions of the Prophet, did any of those companions write it down?
Surely there's got to be at least one.
Absolutely. The companions of Jesus did. Matthew and John were companions of Jesus. Why didn't one of those companions write it down? Now, some Muslims will say, well, they didn't know how to read. Certainly they knew how to read and write. You can't tell me the Arabs in the 7th century didn't know how to read and write. We know that the Quran was written down under the time of Uthman by a man named Zayd ibn Thabit. Who was Zayd ibn Thabit? He was a secretary of Muhammad. What is a secretary doing if he doesn't read and write? Secretaries write, that by definition. Otherwise, they're not secretaries. Why didn't Zayd ibn Thabit write it down?
Yes.
Can you see the problems here?
Yes.
If Muslims are, you can't have it both ways. You've got to have some reference point. Now, here's the question I always ask my Muslim friends. So, when was it written down?
Yes.
When was this biography written down? Was it written down in the 7th century? No. Was it written down in the 8th century? Yes. 765 is the date. And the person that wrote it in 765 is named Ibn Ishaq. All right, where is it? It doesn't exist. We don't even have the 8th century biography. The late 8th century biography. So what biography do we have? Alfred Guillaume, what did he get his material from? I've already mentioned his name, Ibn Hisham. Who is Ibn Hisham and when did he write? Ibn Hisham was writing between 820 and 833. He dies in 833. That's the 9th century. That means the first reference we have, the first reference from within Muslim sources from Muhammad
years, yes.
is 200 years after the fact. If Muhammad died in 632, we don't get it written down until 833. That's 200 years. Why in the world did it take them 200 years to write down the prophet's life? If this is the greatest of all prophets, if this is the final prophets, if this is the prophet that supersedes all the previous prophets, if this is the one Arabic prophet they have, why in the world did they wait 200 years to write down his biography?
Someone that important, someone that valuable, you would think there would be hundreds of people that would be wanting to document this person's life, this person's testimony.
Absolutely. If everything that Muslims are dependent on comes from this one man, without Muhammad, Islam falls.
So how do we know this? I mean, you've been studying this for many years. Are these relatively new findings?
No, this has been around. We've known this for hundreds of years. Even the Muslims have known this for 1,200 years. Muslims know these dates. The Muslim scholars know the dates. The Muslims on the street don't know this, and I hope you're listening. Those of you who are listening, are you seeing the implications of what we're saying? Everything you know about your prophet, everything that you follow, all these stories concerning his life, do not get written down in the 7th century, do not get written on the 8th century. They're not written down until the 9th century. Now tell me, Ibn Hisham, did he ever know the prophet? No. So where did Ibn Hisham get his material from? From Ibn Ishaq. Where did Ibn Ishaq get his material from? See, that's the million-dollar question. So we've got to bring that onto the table. We've got to put that there and say, hold on a minute, we've got a problem here. The question that follows that is, therefore, can we trust any of it?
Yes.
Should we be trusting, as a historian, or just even as a layperson, as yourself,
yes.
You're a layperson,
That's
would
right.
you trust anything written about Jesus Christ 200 years after the fact?
No.
233 AD. Can you imagine? We being dependent on material about Jesus from 233 AD, and that nothing was written prior to that time.
Yeah, no, absolutely not.
None of us would trust it.
Yes.
We would ask, what in the world? Now, we would have an excuse in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century not to have things written down, because remember, back at that time, all they had was papyrus to write on.
Yes.
And papyrus, by its very definition, disintegrates within about 100 years. So it would be understandable if nothing had been written down the 1st or 2nd century. Many people would say that even the disciples who were there, they were fishermen, they were not intellectuals, they were not academic, they were not people that could read or write. But we knew Matthew was. Matthew was a tax collector. He was certainly would have known how to read or write. We know Luke was a doctor, medical doctor, so he could read or write. But nonetheless, we would certainly be able to excuse it by saying we wouldn't expect anything to be written down that early. You can't make that excuse by the 7th century. You can't make that excuse in a place like Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. These are the 5 big cities, the great cities that were conquered by the Arabs in 638, 639, and 640. So within 10 years of Muhammad's death, already you have the 5 great cities of the Levant under their control. You can't tell me that there weren't libraries in these cities. You can't tell me that there were not educated people.
Yes.
These people were well educated.
Yes.
Certainly they could have written it down. Why do they wait 200 years to write down his biography? That's the first problem. But that has huge implications for what we're going to talk about.
That's right. I mean, this leads me to my next question. What are the revisionists saying? I mean, what are some of the new findings that are coming out now of recent about the life of Muhammad?
The revisionists are asking this question for a very good reason, because the revisionists, by definition, are people that are now coming up with a new revision of that classical account. And that's all they're saying, and that's all that revisionist means, to revise the classical account and to ask the historical question. If everything we know from Muhammad living in the 7th century is not come down to us until the 9th century, then how can we trust it if it's that late? We wouldn't say that about anybody, any other great creator of any other religion, or any other great prophet, or even any other great man of God. We would never expect that which was written down to have waited 200 years in a time period when there's no excuse not to write it down.
So now what's happening is that we've got these new historians who are researching and digging up some of the earliest sources and unearthing and uncovering a little bit more about the life of Muhammad. Is that right?
What they're doing is, since everything we know is from the 9th century, they said we have to be careful about trusting it. We have to be careful about trusting that classical account. Let's go back to the 7th century. Let's come back here to where Muhammad was living. Let's come back to that same time period. And let's ask whether or not that which the 9th century people are telling us jives with the period, jives with the time, jives with the place
I mean,
that Muhammad would have lived.
This is very important. This would be something that Muslims would be interested in finding out themselves.
I would if I was a Muslim. I'm sure any
Yes.
Muslim listening to this should be interested in this. Because if any religion is going to be held credible, it has to have a model, and of course the model for Islam is Muhammad. And if Muhammad is going to be held credible in the 21st century, as Jesus Christ is credible in the 21st century, they have to pass he has to pass the historical test.
Yes.
And the historical test is simply this: can we trust what we know about Muhammad? I would say absolutely not. Because what we know about Muhammad is not 1,400 years old. What we know about the Muhammad is only 1,200 years old. We've got to ask this question. It's absolutely important. And that's why we're starting out this series by bringing forward to the people that are watching this, if we have any doubt concerning the historicity of Muhammad, if we have any doubt, then we need to ask, what then do we know about Muhammad? Now that's the historical question. We're going to leave that to one side, but we need to introduce that into this whole segment. Because for Muslims, they've got to come up with a better answer than we just trust it. How can you trust it? Why should we trust it if it is that late? All right, that's the historical problem. Now what we're going to do in the next series is we're going to go back and say, fine, we'll keep that to one side. What we now next to do after that is, regardless of whether we trust it or not, let's take a look again at the classical model and let's unpack it a little bit. And let's still look at the classical model and let's ask whether or not even the classical model that the Muslims follow, the model that the Muslims have given to the world, the model that the Muslims have to use as their authority, as their paradigm for how they're to live, how they're to walk, talk, eat, drinks. Because every Muslim today in the 21st century has to look back at Muhammad in the 7th century and needs to see him as their model. And we need to find out even if that model is relevant for today. What we're going to do now is unpack in the next series, next episode, we're going to unpack a little bit that question.
Before we move on, I mean, this would be a very sensitive subject for any Muslim. I mean, who you're talking about here is someone that is quite dear, quite valuable to them. You've answered the question. You believe that we can't trust what has been taught about the life of Muhammad, historically, the classical account. We can't trust that. You're saying that's not true. Why is it that you're saying that? Do you have a bias against Muslims? Why are you saying it?
Listen, of course I have a bias. I admit that. Absolutely have a bias. But the question I'm asking has no bias. This is the historical question. This is a question we need to ask of any great historical figure. Any great historical figure must fit the environment from which they live, must fit the occasions from which they speak about. And see, Muslims tell me all the time, but yes, we don't care about history because Islam as itself stands above history. The Quran stands above history. Muhammad stands above history. And I say no. No one stands above history. The historical question is a question that was asked of Jesus Christ. We had to answer that question. And we've had that question still thrown at us. And I find fascinating that Muslims ask me, how can we trust this Jesus? They're asking a historical question. How can we know that Jesus ever claimed to be God? How can we ever know that God ever took on human form and came down to earth and entered time and space? How could we ever know that Jesus ever did the things that you say?
Yes.
Those are historical questions. So they demand it of Jesus. They don't demand it of their prophet Muhammad, who supposedly brought this revelation. We're going to ask that question now. But we're going to move on to another question rather than take up all the time with this. We now want to look at that classical model. We want to look at the Muhammad that the Muslims are following. We want to look at the Muhammad that all Muslims have to follow. They have no other choice. They have to follow Muhammad. And we're asking, is he the best model? Or is Jesus Christ the better model? Yes. I want to bring them home. I want to bring them home to Jesus Christ. That's my agenda. I admit it right up front. But the material that we're going to use to come to that conclusion, anybody can ask. In fact, I would say everybody should ask. Let's go with it.
Jay, thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I think these are very important questions. I'm sure that you would be enthralled to find out a little bit more about why you believe what you believe. And this is a question that every single person needs to be faced with. Why is it that I believe what I believe? Is it simply a blind faith, or is it a true faith? And this true faith needs to have substance. As Jay mentioned, it needs to have historical substance. So please stay in tune for the very next episode of Midnight Cry. God bless.